It's Father's Day weekend, and let's face it, dads tend to get fewer props than moms, right? I mean, Mother's Day is a much bigger deal than Father's Day. I actually found out while working on the talk for this week that the Mother's Day was actually established by President Woodrow Wilson as the second Sunday in May back in 1914. But guess when Father's Day was established as its own particular day nationwide? 1972. Over half a century later after Mother's Day was established. And so I hope you take a moment and make sure the dads in your life get some well-deserved appreciation. Today we're wrapping up a series called Identity Theft. And the whole series has been about our fundamental identity as Christ followers. Our true identity is not defined by what other people say we are, or even about who we think we are. Our true identity is found in who God says we are. I mean, there are times where our true identity is taken from us, or we've forgotten it for some reason. And so this whole series has been about God restoring back to us our true identity. And as we celebrate Fathers and even Father's Day weekend, we're going to discover or maybe rediscover another part of our identity, our true identity as followers of Jesus. Through the final chapter in the life of a guy we've been talking about through this entire series, a guy by the name of Joseph. Now, a quick review to catch everybody up to speed on good old Joseph. Joseph's a guy in the Old Testament. He lived centuries before the birth of Jesus. And he was the great-grandson of the guy named Abraham, the one to whom God said that he would bless him and that his descendants would be the ones that the whole world would be blessed through them. Now, Joseph is one of those descendants. And as we've seen, Joseph's family, they didn't look much like a group of people who were out to change the world for God. They were pretty busy being dysfunctional and even vengeful. In Joseph's family, there were 12 brothers in all. He was the next to youngest, but his youngest brother, Benjamin, was born many, many years later. And so for all intents and purposes, Joseph grew up as the youngest child. And he was Dad's favorite, and it really wasn't much of a secret. It was blatant favoritism in the family, and it led to a whole bunch of jealousy and animosity that eventually the older brothers, they just had enough. As they plotted against Joseph, they faked his death, they sold him into slavery. And he ends up as a slave in the home of a guy by the name of Potiphar. Now eventually Joseph gets accused of a crime that he didn't commit, but since he's a slave, he didn't have a voice, and so he was thrown immediately into prison. But after being in prison for years, the Bible notes that God was with him. And he ends up finding favor with Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world. And Joseph becomes Pharaoh's second in command. After all the pain and all the abuse and all the betrayal, Joseph ends up being the second most powerful man in the world. I mean, it's an incredible riches to rags to riches story. I mean, you gotta love it. And Joseph is put in charge of the food distribution during a time of great famine in Egypt and really throughout the world. It put Joseph in this very influential position in that part of the world in his day. And so everybody from surrounding countries, they all started coming to Egypt to get food. And to get the food, they had to go through Joseph. And so everybody's coming to Joseph for food, to get food during this time of famine. And guess who shows up? You got it. Joseph's brothers. The ones that had sold him into slavery, they're the ones that come looking for food. And get this. He recognizes them, but they didn't recognize him. I mean, you just kind of get the feeling that this is going to be good. And Joseph keeps his identity concealed, and he starts messing with his brothers. First, he accuses them of being spies, and the brothers explain that they're 10 of 12 brothers, that the reason they're only 10 in his presence is because they sold one into slavery, and the youngest brother is still back home with dad. I mean, they come out and they say it out loud. Now, that would have been a good time for Joseph to reveal his true identity, right? But he doesn't. He has them thrown into jail. 3 days go by. And then he lets all of them out except for the youngest. And he says this to them. He says, if you really are an honest man, if you're a really honest man, choose one of your brothers to remain in prison. The rest of you may go home with grain to your starving families. But you must bring back your youngest brother to me. This will prove that you're telling me the truth, and you will not die." Well, the brothers huddle up and they start speaking in their native tongue, not realizing that Joseph can understand every word. And the oldest brother starts laying into the others for what they did to Joseph years ago, saying that what's happening right now is a payback from God. Joseph is overhearing the conversation, and something happens that we really need to take note of. As his brothers are talking amongst themselves, the Bible says that Joseph turns away and he breaks down crying. Maybe he thought that the pain was gone, buried beneath, the years that had gone by. But then he sees them, he hears them speaking in their native language, and it all comes flooding back. I mean, that's so often the way that it happens with deep personal wounds. We find ways to hit the mute button on the pain, but then something happens and all of a sudden it just comes surging back on us. Well, eventually Joseph stops putting his brothers through the ringer and he reveals who he really is. And if they weren't already freaked out enough, when they realized that the second most powerful man in the world is their little brother that they had assaulted and they'd sold into slavery years ago, I mean, they truly believe that they're toast now. But instead of retaliating like they were sure Joseph would, instead Joseph reconciles with his brothers. I mean, though he was the one who was wrong, though he was the one that was sold down the river, look what he says to them. "Don't be angry with yourselves that you did this to me. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. He sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. God has sent me here to keep you and your families alive so that you will become the great nation, that you'll become the great nation that God promised that we would be." Now, some may say that this shows that humans don't really have free will, that whatever happens, God made it to happen. But that's not what Joseph is saying. He's saying that God is bigger than your sin. God is up to things in this world that nothing that you did to me can ever counteract. God can even use your sin to bring about His good in this world. Joseph sees God's bigger purposes in life. He sees how he's fitting into the whole story, and this leads Joseph to be this man of reconciliation. And I love the way that he puts it, that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And so Joseph grows from being this spoiled little daddy's boy to a slave, to a prisoner, to the second most powerful man in the known world, to a hero that saved countless lives of thousands and keeps the mission of his family to bless the world going. I mean, life can be crazy sometimes, but I love Joseph's story because even though the circumstances determined by those around him look bleak, God is the one who ultimately determined Joseph's identity, no matter what happens. I mean, as you read the story of Joseph reuniting with his brothers and forgiving them, it's a beautiful thing to watch God restore the dream for this particular family. And since it's Father's Day weekend, it's good to make one other note of one other detail. One of the things that Joseph says after all this is he asks a question. He says, "Is my father still alive?" I mean, as a dad, how would you like to know that some of the very first words out of your long-lost son's mouth after 22 years were asking about you? I mean, his dad was far from perfect. I mean, his favoritism had cost Joseph's family dearly. But Joseph deeply loved his father. And I pray for our dads that your sons and your daughters will have this kind of love too. But this isn't just a story about forgiveness. It's not just a story about a single family being reunited and getting back together through some crazy God-led providence. I mean, this is your story. This is my story. This is our story. You see, what God was doing in Joseph's story was helping put God's family back together. This one family is where the entire nation of Israel comes from. This one family is where we get the 12 tribes of Israel, which the rest of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, revolves around. And when Joseph's family arrives in Egypt, they're about 70 people. 430 years later, there are close to 3 million. I mean, that's some exponential growth. God preserves Joseph's biological family because God is up to something significant in this world. It's through Joseph's biological family that one day Jesus would come into this world. And so the preservation of Joseph's biological family was ultimately about the preservation of God's spiritual family. I mean, when I talk about family, that is our last identity statement that we're looking at this week. According to God, those who are followers of Jesus become members of one spiritual family. That's who you are. I mean, God describes his community like a family. I mean, look at these identity statements in the New Testament. I mean, 1 Peter says this, it says, show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers. I mean, it goes on in the book of Galatians, it says, therefore, as we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who belong to the family of believers. I mean, Jesus draws all people to himself, regardless of ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic standing, and calls them into this new gathering that he calls the church. I mean, he says the church is his family, and the church is the spiritual family of all who believe. So for you as a follower of Jesus, that is part of your identity, whether you realize it or not. The church is meant to be your spiritual family. It's such a tight family that it actually is described in the Bible, it's described as the body, like the body of Christ. I mean, there's nothing like a family when family's working right. It can be one of those beautiful things on the entire planet. The place where love and forgiveness and identity are forged and shared. Now, none are perfect, at least that I know of. But great things can still happen there. And God describes the church as family. Now, I don't really want us all to break into the Sister Sledge song, we are family. But I do want to know, do we really get that that's a part of our true identity? That we're family? I mean, don't miss this now. The Bible doesn't say that we're like a family. It says that we are one, that we are the church, that we are a family. So what does that look like? Here at Community, people experience family in a variety of different ways. One of the most powerful ways is in the context of a small group. I mean, let's be honest, it's hard to truly experience family in larger gatherings. But when you get into smaller groups and you interact with people and you share food and you serve others and you start doing life together, I mean, there's no doubt at times it can be complicated, but there's nothing like a small group when a small group's working right. So how about you? How do you see yourself? What is your identity? Are you shaped by only the circumstances that are in your life? Or are you allowing God to give you a new identity as part of his family? I know. Maybe some of you are hesitant to let anybody to get close enough to you from the church so that they're like close enough where you could describe it as family. I mean, for one thing, remember this guy? I mean, there's plenty of Cousin Eddies in every church. You know who you are. Well, maybe you don't, but we know who you are. But it goes beyond some folks not just, being someone whose company we enjoy. Maybe you've been burned by being a part of God's family in the past. Somebody gossiped about you or took advantage of you or betrayed you in some way. Stepping into your identity as a family it's complicated, it's messy. And all families are somewhat dysfunctional, right? But what's at stake? If we don't pursue and embrace our identity as family, I mean, what's at stake? Joseph's story of his family reunion, it starts off so well. I mean, Joseph provides for his father and his brothers, and they all move to Egypt, and they prosper. They do really well. But then look what happens. The Bible says that eventually a new king came into power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, look, the people of Israel now outnumber us. They're stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. This family, that was able to do so well in Egypt because of Joseph, had become so incredibly faithful in fulfilling his identity as someone called by God to be a mission to bless the world. They go from being honored and welcomed as new citizens in Egypt to becoming enslaved by a new Pharaoh. And it says that's because the new Pharaoh hadn't heard of Joseph. But think about that. Why were there no other Joseph-like people in the family of God after him? I mean, from all we can tell, they became so self-centered as the extended family in Egypt and enjoying the blessing of what it meant to be God's people, that nobody else stepped up and embraced their true identity as a family, as those who were blessed in order to bless the world like Joseph did. I mean, apparently they had kind of kept on feathering their own nest and looking out for their own immediate biological blessed family. They lost their sense of being God's people, God's family chosen to extend this blessing to the world. They lost their identity. And not only did they stop blessing the world, they ended up as slaves. And in slavery, the Israelites were in slavery for about 400 years. I mean, this is a cautionary tale, folks. I mean, see, we're called to be family to one another. Not just so that we can have the encouragement and the support and the camaraderie that we all so deeply need to become, who we're really meant to be as followers of Jesus. I mean, it's as important as that is. The world needs us to be family to each other. I mean, Jesus said something that the more I think about it, the more it strikes me about how high the stakes are here. Jesus said, "Everyone will know that you're one of my disciples because of your love for each other." Notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say that the world will know that you follow him because of your morality or because of your honesty or your piety or because of how we serve the poor or the oppressed. He says that people who have not yet found their way back to God in Jesus would know who we are and what it's like because of how we love one another, because of how we are like family to one another. I mean, folks, a huge part of Jesus' plan for changing the world and saving the world is that his followers would become this close-knit community. I mean, so close, they'd be described as a family, that the outside world would see what we have and they would go to one another, man, I want that in my life. I need that in my life. And so I got to ask you, even as I ask myself, are you going about your relationships with others who are part of community in that way? That you truly believe that the way you live would be inspiring, it would be compelling to the people who are currently far from God. As they look at your life, those that you live with, you work with, you go to school with, do they see the love that you have for someone else? I mean, does anybody have the chance to see real brotherhood, like real sisterhood, true family ties between you and somebody who's not a part of your biological or extended family because of how you love them and how much they love you? I mean, for some of us, what we might need to do today is finally take the step and embrace who we really are in our true identity as Christ followers. I mean, when we discover identity, we realize that we're not just showing up for a service on the weekend and that's it. I mean, I'm hoping that somebody today would hear what God has said about us being family and go, I want to be who I really am. And I can't be family with anybody in the church if I'm not connected to a small group. And so today could be your day. For somebody, literally today could be your next big step in stepping up and stepping into who you really are as a Christ follower. And for the others of us who are already in a small group, maybe what we need to do is to realize that small group isn't just about showing up for every week or every other week. It's about making ourselves available to each other during the week. It's about becoming more authentic and real about what's really going on in our lives with at least some of the people in our small group so they can really be there for us too. I mean, one author called it giving someone the gift of going second, and I love that. And when I'm more open about the stuff in my life, then somebody else in the group doesn't have to go first. They've been given the gift of going second. I mean, Jesus couldn't have been more clear. We not only need to know who we are as family because of our common relationship with Him, we not only need that love from one another, the world needs to be able to see that love so they can become interested in experiencing that for themselves too. I mean, think about it. What if because of the way that you loved and you supported someone and were there for somebody who's a part of the church, just because you know that we're family and that we need to do for each other, and you know, what if someone saw that and that sparked something in them and they got interested and they ended up finding their way back to God through it? I mean, that really happens. I mean, it's happened so many times over the course of the history of our church. I mean, our church, began as a church of small groups even before we ever had weekend services, because we fundamentally realized that we're family. I mean, we are. Let's be who we are for our own sake, for the sake of each other, but ultimately for the sake of the world.